Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Edge. I'm Harold Muliati, filling in for Rick Zanatti, and I'm joined by our co-host, Dr. Susan Nash. We've got an interesting guest for you today, so let's get going. So today, our guest is Forrest Lamb. He is a personality professional specializing in Myers-Briggs. So Forrest, you've got quite an interesting history. You were a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. You also did, I believe, aeronautical engineering. What tell us a little bit about the path that led you to be a personality professional and what that means.
Well, my mother always said that I was a character, so it's kind of a natural progression. I really like people. I like motivating, moving people. So all throughout my Air Force career, I had plenty of opportunities to work with a lot of people. And one of the most exciting parts that I found is when I find that most people go their whole life never really understanding who they are, their benefits, or anything about themselves. And I began to, working through my career, I began to know that I had effect on people. I was able to motivate them. So one of the main things that happened to me once in my career, I guess you'd say a personality run-in with one of my commanders. And I remember at the time I felt, at first I was a little bit taken aback. Then I became sort of angry. And as I began to research, I was working with a psychologist, and he introduced me to some of the work of Dr. Carl Jung. Carl Jung is an analytical psychologist, and he did a lot of work on with personality. One of the things that Dr. Jung had discovered, centuries before, most people assumed that your personality was driven by movement of the celestial bodies, whether they're stars, planets, moons, and those types of things. Well, that goes on for years. Where they come up with the phrase lunatic, they believe that the moon phases cause certain behavior. Well, he began to analyze that there are certain, I guess, constructs of the subconscious mind where the personality is laid. And so during the time that I was going through this challenge at work, I began to do a lot of research and reading in it, and I became fascinating. Now, you got to understand that me being an engineer, I'm somewhat analytical. And most analytical, cerebral people, we're not into the touchy-feely. And so normally I'm not moved by this, but some of the points they brought out were kind of like on point with me. And so that's what sort of really got me moving to this thing. And so later in my career, when I began to realize that I was liking the subject more and more, and that engineering by itself was no longer, I guess, that fascinating point for me, I decided to get my certification and start working towards working with people and helping them with their personalities. Um, One of the things I guess I found most interesting is, you've heard of the concept when they talk about personality conflicts. Well, begin to realize there's really no such thing. What it runs into is the fact that we don't really understand or appreciate each other. For instance, my wife prefers introversion. You've heard that phrase before. And I guess I'm consider myself an extrovert. Well, what that talks about is how I approach life. Extroverts are more communicative. They interact with a lot of people. They have multiplicity of relationships. Where those who approach life with an introverted fashion, a little bit more quiet, reserved. And so it was kind of funny because a conversation with my wife would go something like this. I'll be doing all the talking. Blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm looking at her and she's not moving. So I look at her and I go, are you listening to me? And she'll go, mm-hmm. Well, I said, well, do you mind communicating with your face to let me know that you're listening to me? Well, later on, I come to find out, later that night, I heard her sharing with my daughter, and she was almost repeating what I said verbatim. I realized that she was actually intently listening and actually processing. And so I eventually learned that when I'm talking with her, what I'll do is I'll prep her ahead of time saying, I want to talk about this subject, and I'm going to come back in 5 minutes because she needs time to process. And so that's how my career, and I begin to use it at my work in different places, and I begin to find out that I get more response from the people I work around. So that's pretty much how I got into it. It was just a fascinating scientific thing for me at first, but now I really enjoy it.
Well, it's so interesting because, I mean, with your career in the military, clearly you had a lot of opportunities to work in teams and motivate teams, and you'd have a wide range of people and diverse backgrounds, diverse ethnicities, and so being able to, I guess, keep from misinterpreting people is a big plus.
Yes, it is. And I found out I made a very career limiting move early in my life because I did not understand what you just said. I had a boss who was somewhat quiet and reserved. And later on, as I come to study, he was more introverted. And introverts like to write. Extroverts like myself will talk before we sit down and spend time writing. So one time he asked me to write him a long email about some project I was working on. Now, in my mind, I'm saying, well, you look out the window and there's the concrete out there, so why am I writing you to tell you about it? Well, now, he's a colonel, I'm a captain. You can see that attitude really did not go across too well, okay? And so that's why I began to learn where it was beneficial to learn those things, how to talk to people. People basically want to feel psychologically comfortable and content. And so they seek for environments that basically fuel that. And so I began to learn that I'm going to have to be a little bit flexible and learn those techniques to be able to work with them. So I wish I had found out a little bit earlier in my career, Susan. That really was an eye opener for me. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
It's interesting. Where were some of the places where you were stationed?
Well, I was stationed not as many as I would have liked to. I started out at Little Rock Air Force Base, which happened to be my home. And it was so funny that right after I graduated, I moved all my stuff from college and I went home. And so my mother asked me, well, when do you have to report in? I said, I'll let you know. Well, one morning I got up and put my uniform and started heading out the door. She said, where are you going? Well, I'm just going to the base right out here. She told me at that time, she said, I guess you know your room is for rent now. Since you're on your own, you need to pay for it. So I thought it was sort of funny. I really got a kick out of that. So I've also was stationed in San Bernardino, California, which I really love. Skiing at Big Bear, going to the beach. Yeah, that California's the place to be. One of the most interesting places, I guess, was the Republic of South Korea. I was stationed there at Osan Air Base,
yeah.
and what was really nice about it is you find when you leave the West that over in Korea, people take friendship and relationships very seriously. Over in the U.S., where we call people our friends, are really more or less acquaintances. And so I made some really, really close friends and had some remarkable experiences over there. I've had a couple of tours down to places like Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and those type of places. And the Air Force just could have dropped me off there. As a matter of fact, when I was there, I called a friend of mine and told him, tell the Air Force I quit. I'm not coming back.
You got lucky.
Yeah. No, I wasn't quite that lucky.
Yeah, I've been to a few. I've been to a few bases. Some are more interesting than others. I guess from the Air Force, I've been to Guam and Okinawa. Those are interesting.
Well, I work as a civilian now with the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps is always joking about me in the Air Force. I told them that, the Air Force, the most prominent base feature is the golf course. So of course my Marine buddies are laughing at me because of it. They say, well, you guys wear business suits and we actually in combat. We joke about that all the time. But I found that the most remarkable thing about me being in the military is the people. You can go. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter really where do you go on the globe right now. If I run into somebody in the military, I have a brother somewhere, and I really like that. And there are very few corporate environments that you actually find that type of closeness and camaraderie, and I really love that.
Well, so you've worked with a lot of Marines. My son was in the Marines, and he turned 21 in Afghanistan. But wow. He was just for 4 years in a rifleman. But anyway, you probably deal with a lot of PTSD, right?
Well, that's one of the things that I guess that, some of the things that you don't recognize when you first come back, that things impact you that greatly. So I really have a healthy appreciation for a lot of the Marines because most of the Marine Corps, they ride on the tip of the blade. They're out in front. And so I really have a lot of respect and a lot of honor for them and work with those Marines and stuff. And I really feel for them, the compassion, because there are a lot of young guys and basically they have to grow up quick.
Yeah. My son ended up re-enlisting, which was a relief for his mom, even though I liked stalking him in Kaneohe Bay. But he ended up going back to school, going to school for the first time, and he became a mechanical engineer.
Oh, okay. Well, I tell you, I really have enjoyed my career, and I really enjoyed this opportunity to meet with you guys. I find the whole area of with the Myers-Briggs very fascinating. I find it more fascinating that I get to take my time to know people. Most of the time, we go through our relationships, we rip right through them, and we really don't take time to reflect and get to really know and appreciate people. So what this has done for me, it has really forced me to take my time to really study people and understand them and really appreciate them, which is really one of the main reason I do this is that at the very end of the day, that we can use those differences constructively. In this current climate where there's diversity, whether the diversity because of ethnicity and those types of things, this has become very, very important because as you realize now, the world is a global economy. It used to be my neighborhood, my four and no more, but now everything in the world is global now. If you think, for instance, the Boeing 777 aircraft is manufactured in 26 different countries, different components, and all come together only to be assembled in Washington. I live here in New Orleans. Of course, back during Katrina, the port of New Orleans was shut down. Well, a lot of people said, well, why do we want to rebuild the port of New Orleans? It's one of the few deep water ports in the south of the United States. And what happens is all the goods that are manufactured north of us need to come to New Orleans to transfer to get out to the globe and vice versa. So that during that time, we begin to realize that hurricanes in New Orleans are no longer a local event. They are now a global event. And so now when you look at businesses and relationships, even right now, you guys probably have clients and customers that are all over the globe right about now. And so now it is no longer just my neighborhood. And so we have to think globally now. And unfortunately, in the West, we're a little bit behind. If you think about people from foreign countries like Australia, everything in Australia is global. As soon as they leave the soil, they're immediately international.
Oh, yeah.
Someone shared with me a joke once, and they said, what do you call a person who speaks three languages? And the answer was he's trilingual. Then the question continues, what do you call a person who speaks two languages? And of course, the answer is bilingual. Then he said, what do you call a person who only speaks one language? And he said, you call him an American.
Yeah. So, how would you say that the getting to know your personality type, how does that help people work with other people in their organization or just in their relationships with other people?
Well, one of the things I find out is people like to feel comfortable. They like to feel comfortable with themselves. They like to feel comfortable with fit in the organization. And one of the things, I guess, in not understanding who you are, and more important than understanding others, is there is oftentimes miscommunication. And communication is critical in most corporations. For instance, when I was talking to Sarah about your company, she mentioned that you have people all over. For instance, Susan, you're located in a different location altogether than Harold. Well, now you guys are going to have to be able to communicate. And we found that problem a while ago when we were trying to get this Skype connected. That communication becomes critical. Okay, so I think right now it's more important than anything because now things are international. Now we have companies that are multinational corporations. They have people from various different ethnicities, every different cultures and types of things with them, and so it has become more and more important. And then the idea of communication is further made more complex by the personalities, which is another whole different level to it. So it's not a matter of you just literally communicating one to one. Now you have all these other factors come into play in these things, and so I think it is ultimately critical. And any company who does not pay attention to this is going to be short-lived. Companies like, for instance, the Marriott Corporation has internalized the Myers-Briggs. They have internal staff that do the same processing because they recognize it's important. The Myers-Briggs is also used by many of the Fortune 100 companies now are embracing the same philosophy. So I think it's very, very important, and you really can't work without it.
Well,
I agree with that.
We've also got we've got a presentation that you put together. Should we go through that?
I like to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go here. Just let me know when to advance.
Okay. One of the concepts I like to do is to use my influence to basically affirm positive self-awareness. In other words, bring to the people the understanding of who they are and themselves. I also want them to inspire them to have a healthy appreciation not only for their strength, but also for the strengths of others. And more important than anything, I want to basically motivate them to learn how to use those differences more constructively or cooperative. Next slide, please. Now, out of the three types of presentations I conduct, one is presenting types in an organization that we have here on the slide, presenting types in teams, and presenting types in the community. Next slide. The basic objective of the workshops or the presentation, as I mentioned before, is to identify our unique gifts. I like to consider our personalities a gift. I like to enhance our understanding of both ourselves, our motivation, our natural strengths, and potential. And in appreciating the fact that other people are different, they also have motivation, strengths, and natural potential. And more important than anything, as I mentioned before, I want to encourage them how to cooperate and use those differences constructively. Next slide, please. Now, the basic theory behind the Jung principle, as I mentioned earlier, was before Jung, most people believed that the personalities were dictated by the movement of the celestial bodies, whether they're stars, planets, the moon, and etc. But Jung was determined, he's an analytical psychologist, and he was determined to basically define the personalities of normal types of individuals. He concluded that these differences in attitudes and behaviors resulted in a natural tendency of basically of how people use their minds differently. And because of the differences that they use in their mind, people develop corresponding patterns of behavior that basically mirror or mimic those different ways of thinking. Next slide, please. Now, Jung did recognize there are some environmental factors, such as family, culture, and education, that have a small part in shaping our personality, but basically he believed that these preferences are innate, inborn predispositions. Next slide, please. Now, the Myers-Briggs type indicator instrument itself is basically a questionnaire that's designed to help make Carl Jung's theory of personality understandable and useful to ordinary people like you and I. Basically, the results of these variable differences can be the source of miscommunication and misunderstanding, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide. Now, to understand preferences, let's consider this thing called the handedness activity. What I normally do during a workshop is I'm right-handed. So I'll write my signature with my right hand, and then I'll switch hands and use my left hand. Well, one of the things that I immediately noticed that with my right hand is more natural. I don't really have to pay attention to it. I could just kind of almost do it in my sleep, so to speak. But with my left hand, sometimes I even found that I have to actually spell out my name so I don't even actually misspell it. In other words, it's not as native or comfortable to me as my right hand. Although I can write with both, I have a preference for one over the other. Next slide. Now, based on that, on what I just mentioned about the handedness and your personality, the MBTI is broken into four a pair of opposites, just like your right and left hand. You can use both sides of the pair, but one is more natural or dominant. The instrument itself is designed to indicate those inborn personality type preferences. Now, since it doesn't measure skills or the effects of an environment, it is not considered a test. Next slide. Now, here's the construct of what the four opposite pairs. The first pair is basically where people pay their attention, where is their focus. This is broken into the extroversion and introversion. The second opposite pair is how we get information in. There's the sensing type of individuals, and there's the intuition. Now, I'm going to go in a little more depth a little later on a later slide. The third is how we make decisions based on what we've seen and where we get our energies from, and it's broken into thinking, and it's broken into feeling. The last opposite pair is how we approach the life of the world in general. There's the judging, and there's perceiving. Next slide. Now, I think this will help you understand the concept a little better. Now, where do people focus their attention? Now, we often heard of the term introversion and extroversion. Basically, extroverts are people that are generally interactive with others, whereas those who prefer introversion generally look for more opportunities to be quiet and reflect. The extroverts are very sociable, very expressive. This is how you'll see an extrovert at a party, and they may have met everybody at the party by the end of the party. Well, the person who's introverted, usually about halfway through the party, they're ready to go home. They need to spend time to recharge their batteries. Now, if you look at the bottom, there are some words that are used, normally associated with the two types. Extroverts are looked at action, outward, people-orientated, interactive, many relationships, very expressive. They do, think, do. The introverts, on the other hand, are thought of as more reflective, inward, private, concentrated, few relationships, relatively quiet, think, do, think. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at how people pull in information, they're the sensing types and the intuitive. Now, since we've already used the I for introvert, N is the representation of the intuitive. Now, the S types deal mostly with their experiences. They look at what they've observed. They remember the specific thing. They look at factual, concrete, consequential type of thing, where the intuitives look more for the pattern, the meaning, the concept, the abstract. Words that are used to associate with sensing type are facts, realistic, specific, in the present. They keep small relationships. They are practical. They look at actually what is. When you look at the intuitives, on the other hand, they look at ideas, imagination, things that are in general. They look for the future. They look for change, theoretical, what could be. Next slide. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road. This is how we actually make decisions and process the things that we've seen, the information that we've gotten in. The thinking types are thought of as more objective oriented. The feeling types, though the word use the word feeling is a misconception. The word feeling actually deals not with emotion, but deals more with your people oriented in your decision making. For instance, thinking types, they step back and they take an objective view. Whereas the feeling type, they have to step in and then they identify and become involved with those they're working with. They're empathetic. The T types are more analytical. They seem more cold, more distant. Words that are used to associate with thinking types of things like head, detach, things, object, critique, analyze, firm, but fair. But when you look at the feeling types, they're thought of as hard, personal, people, subjective, praise, understand, and merciful. Now, next slide. Now the last part is how we deal with the world in general. There's the judging, there's the perceiving. Now, the judging type, they're considered what I like to consider closed-ended. The perceivers are more open-ended. The judging types are looked at as more organized, systematic, methodical. They like having things decided. Those are the guys that do all the checklists. The perceivers, on the other hand, are more adaptable. They're casual, kind of open-ended. They're kind of very flexible. They like to explore things. Words that are associated with these type are flexible, informative, experience. Let's do it later. Leave my options open. Spontaneous. I can wait. The judging types are more organized. They look at those things in the definitive. So now, when you go through the whole process, what you'll do, you'll end up with a four-letter symbol that represents your personality. For instance, mine is an ENTJ. Extrovert, intuitive, thinker with judgment. They often refer to us as natural leaders. We happen to be very gregarious. We happen to be visionary and those types of things. Now, one of the funniest types when I look at is the ENFP, which is just to the left and above the NTJ. With that F type, remember that feeling type and that perceiving type that are kind of open-ended? These are the guys that like giving life a little extra hug. These are the touchy-feely and the warm feelers. Okay. Next slide.
All right.
Now, really, at the end of the day, what I'm really hoping is that the fact that we had these 16 personality types, not to put ourselves in stovepipes, we actually very uniquely constructed. The idea is to understand that because of these innate preferences that we have a tendency to search for environments that we can more effectively use these preferences, and we develop more productive habits based on these behaviors. As you can possibly see, that when you find yourself in an environment that is not conducive to you effectively using your preferences, or it prevents you from developing those productive habits, stress. And so the idea is to help people to understand that about themselves in the environment so they can make better life choices. They make better life choices with mates. They make better life choices with careers, make better life choices where they live. The idea is to understand that we are different, and we basically differ because of the mental processes that we use. But understand that these processes are what makes up our collective personality. And since we have to work together in a group, the idea is to learn how to appreciate those differences. Last slide. Again, I like to use this influence so I can affirm the positive self-awareness, make you become aware of the person that you are and learn to appreciate it. I like to inspire healthy appreciation of both your strength and the strengths of others. And much more important is to motivate people to cooperatively use those differences collectively. Thank you.
That was great.
Now, typically these are like half-day workshops. You pretty much got the fire hose method in about 15 minutes. So most time we have more time. What we do is we go into interactive groups where we ask different questions and people get to observe and watch how different personality types answer the question and how they behave, and you get a much better appreciation and understanding of it.
Yeah, I've taken the Myers-Briggs inventory a couple of different times with work, and we usually did it for team building to help ourselves understand each other more.
Absolutely.
I think that, and it worked really well. I thought it was effective.
It very and there are other models there. You've heard of DIS, Forlins, and several others. These all assessments are usually all based on the work of Carl Jung. He was kind of like the father of the foundation of these different assessments. And there's interaction between both these assessments. But the key thing that you mentioned earlier is very essential for corporate building, team building. Whether the team building happens to be your corporation, the team building has to be your school, the team building happens to be your family and your relationships. It plays across that whole spectrum. There's some interesting things that maybe if we have some time later, I can come back and join you guys later. I'd like to be able to show you some things on careers and show you how these careers match out. And I think you'll get a real kick out of that.
So when you do the workshops, do you typically go out to corporations, organizations, that sort of thing, to work with their teams, or how do you usually do that?
Right now, we're starting out. I've been doing things that mostly we'd go out to the corporation to meet them with their team, and we do small workshops together. I send them some work ahead of time to be able to some background information. We work with those things. I'm eventually looking at the idea of going to conduct a more webinar based where I can meet a much larger audience.
Yeah.
Similar to like a platform like we have right here. This would be a nice platform to be able to use to be able to work with a larger group. And that's what I'm really looking forward to, because I really want to get this out there. I think it's really important. I really enjoy what I've learned. I enjoy the interaction with the people that I work with, and I'm sure that others will find it just as fascinating.
Oh, definitely. And I think, too, when we have to work in teams where we're sometimes together and sometimes in different, working remotely or with different teams in different locations, it's doubly important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
So, well, I have so many questions, but I don't want to just like dominate Harold. So, anyway.
Oh, no, that's fine.
I just find this so great, because it's a matter of also recognizing under stress people act differently, and then also to be able to do things like well, I was thinking again of the accident with the 737 MAX. I mean, to be able to get at the heart of what's going on there, they're having to ask a lot of questions, and across cultures, and so I don't even know how you could. I mean, how would you advise people to use Myers-Briggs to be able to do forensics, for example?
Well, I'm going to give you an example. I'm a private pilot, and so I've studied a lot of aircraft accidents. And one of the things that they found out very, very early on in the commercial air industry, it used to be that the chief pilot, he was the boss. And what they found out was sometimes that the other crew members would kind of put a back by him, and they couldn't bring certain things up. And they found out, for instance, there was one aircraft, the plane was running out of fuel, and the co-pilot wanted to tell the pilot, but he was so preoccupied, the guy didn't dare talk to him. And so they came up with a process they call cockpit management. And you will find in the cases where basically in that small cockpit, if you really can't communicate, there are hindrances to your communication that's based on your personality. Oftentimes some critical information is not passed on. And as you see the crash of those airlines, you see the results. So even the airline industry began to recognize they could not afford not to know this. And so more and more industries are recognizing that they're impacted by this. Corporations that are unrelated to airlines, you may find it with Kentucky Fried Chicken, the hotel industry. They're beginning to find out that it not only works internal for your staff, it also works with your customers. You have to learn to recognize the cues. For instance, one thing that comes to mind, Susan, is I'm listening to you. At meeting, those who are introvert will prefer to sit quietly and listen. They have something to say, but what ends up happening is the extroverts oftentimes end up dominating the conversation. the introverts they won't say anything. They have something to say. So as a supervisor, I have learned to recognize the cues, and then I'll say, well Bob, we appreciate you, but we haven't heard from Harold in a while. Harold, why don't you have something to say? Okay.
Yeah, it's
So
true. I mean,
so technically, you have to manage that because oftentimes you'll go away and they say, well Harold didn't have nothing to say. Harold couldn't get into the conversation.
although
You know.
I think a lot of introverts are totally fine. They'll just sit in the background and they'll be, I'm okay.
I'm okay. Just leave me alone. Just
Yeah.
as long as my check shows up. Okay? My check. Okay, gotcha. But you're right. But in a corporation now that the corporations are smaller and having to do more with less, we're recognizing that we're leaving a lot of the power of the corporation is left on the table because we haven't taken the time to really appreciate one another for our strengths and our differences. And so, later, as you've been watching the news, you've been seeing a lot of conflicts, a lot of things happening because people have not respected those differences, and those people who have been disrespected all these years are now speaking up. And so, I think it's only right that we actually go to this level and start really delving into the personality, because within that personality is a rich gold mine of opportunities and things that are embedded inside each of us as individual. And most of us, unfortunately, go our whole life and we die never having seen that part of us.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, so here's a question. Do you think robots have personality?
I'll probably get in trouble with someone. I'm sure that someone will write me back if I say something. You know, I guess I would say not technically, really. I guess in the sense of a human being, but I guess everything has a characteristic, and so I guess you could consider it a personality. I guess
That's
even grass has
interesting.
personality, right?
I mean, I guess we love saying that things have personalities. Like people have, you might say your car is kind of temperamental, and you might say,
Yeah,
my car doesn't like
yeah,
this, doesn't like that. So,
yeah. My car is
Well,
arrogant. I hate it.
yeah.
well, I think if robots are, if they're programmed to like avoid each other or do certain things, and then they also
Hmm.
have artificial intelligence, so they learn patterns and things. Well,
Yeah.
then they're going to start developing some kind of patterns, which could maybe be a substitute for personality.
Well, that's interesting because also, like, say for instance, when you think about uh, images, most people associate images with light, but X-ray is a form of light, and it forms an image.
Hmm.
Cosmic rays is a form of light. You can't see it, but it's an image. See, we get hung up on that narrow visible spectrum, but not realizing the light spectrum is a much larger spectrum, and the images don't necessarily have to be in visible light. So using that same concept with personalities, we just assuming that human beings have personality. I got a couple of cats that are characters. They got a personality. Okay. Yeah. So I assume if my cat can have a personality, I guess a robot can have personality too, Susan.
Cool.
Right. So we're about at the end of our time, but we've got our one special question for Life Edge that we always ask our guests.
Go for it.
So, Forrest, what is it in life that's given you? Wait, my mic's off.
Now it's
There you
done.
are.
Were you able to hear me though?
Oh yeah, I can
Yeah.
still hear you.
So, as our guests may not have been able to hear me as my microphone was actually off, we've got our one special question that we always ask our guests on Life Edge. Forrest,
Okay.
what is the one thing in life that has given you an edge?
It's the challenges. Oftentimes we don't want the challenges, but it is the challenges that really pushed us. When I mentioned about that colonel that I had that challenge with, when he challenged me, if he had not challenged me, I doubt very seriously I would have achieved what I've achieved in life. I would have been the status quo, still sitting on the same corner, doing the same old thing. But it's that affront, that challenge that he made to me that made me dig into and discover of this uniqueness. So what I would say, the thing that pushed me over the edge is that challenge. To someone actually challenging me, pushing back. You actually learn more in defeat sometimes than you learn in victory. And so I found that basically is taking me over the edge. It is giving me the freedom to let go. But at the same time, it also gave me a much more healthy appreciation for other individuals and the things that they're going through. I guess the word empathy, I guess that's part of my introverted side.
It's a really good answer for us because, yeah, you can hone yourself all you like, but until you're really tested, I guess you don't really know if you've been doing the right thing or not, right?
Absolutely.
I totally agree with that. That's great.
Yeah.
All righty.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on. It's been a great show, and you've brought a lot of interesting stuff to our to Life Edge, and we might
Definitely.
like to have you on again. You said you've got a lot more to
Absolutely.
talk about, so.
Well, I would enjoy being with you guys again. I can't think of a more wonderful afternoon than talking with you two guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hope
Thank
they
you,
help me have
Forrest.
on again.
Great.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for
All right,
tuning
then.
in, everyone, and we'll see you next time on Life Edge.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.